Hello, welcome to the Paranormal Peep Show, and this is Neil Geddes-Ward with my fellow host, Andrew Chaplin. Hi Andy, how are you?
Hello Neil, yep, I'm pretty good. Halloween is rapidly approaching, and I'm just in the process of kind of booking venues and things like that. I want to make a very shameless plug for tuned in events. So if people want to kind of find out about psychic things going on, psychic fairs and demonstrations in the southeast of England, log on to www.tunedinevents.co.uk or visit the Tuned In Events Facebook page. The website is in the process of being updated, so I'm kind of redesigning that to make it more fluid for mobiles. Other than that, how's things in your life?
Well, yeah, fine. I was actually I'm sort of doing the work on the video editing front at the moment. I've actually got another art commission coming up, so I've been working on the roughs for that. But I've actually been approached by an agency to do some work for a very well-known media company, and they said yes, they'd like to employ us. And then suddenly, 2 weeks later, I suddenly get the nod to say, no, they don't want to employ me, even after I went through the little test. So I won't mention their name, but I'm sure their name will crop up in the next couple of hours, as we're going to be talking about the media world in general, the film and TV world. And we're going to look behind the scenes at that. And it's not all as it seems, all nice, bright, shiny and lovely, because there seems to be some sort of sinister things. Now, we had this gentleman come do a talk for us at the High Wycombe Paranormal Meetup group, which you came along to, so you know a little bit about it. But I'll introduce tonight's guest, which is Carl James, who he presents the website The Truth Seeker's Guide. So hello, Carl, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Thanks very much for having me on the show. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much indeed for coming back. And you did a great presentation, which was an excellent presentation. Lots of people there. And I think it opened up people's eyes and ears to the kind of the way that these companies work. It's not just films we're being presented with. It's all sorts of other ideas and things like that. And I hope we'll try and cover a lot about that tonight.
Yeah.
And maybe at the end, we'll talk about maybe does it have any kind of ramifications with the paranormal, because we are the Paranormal Peep Show, and maybe you can say yes or no, it doesn't, because I'm interested on why they're doing all this kind of stuff to us. So it kind of you sort of suggest it's a manipulation. So do you want to? I mean, I don't really know how to start this. So do you want to start at the beginning, because I know that you've got a hell of a lot of research there. You start where you want to start, Carl.
Right. Yeah. Well, I've most of my life, as many people do, I've had a long interest in television programs and films and Americana and that sort of thing, music as well, obviously, and took it all in my stride and never thought there was anything untoward with any of it. But more recent years, when I've sort of started looking into alternative research subjects and that sort of thing, just really sort of lifted the lid for me on what the media is really all about. And it's not all this sort of nice it's distraction, but not in a good way. So it's yeah, and I think also because some people might know that I've done an awful lot of research into science fiction, specifically in the media as well. I've written 2 books on that now, and having been a lifelong fan of things like Star Wars and Star Trek and all these kind of big franchises and that sort of thing, and just really looking at it and thinking, what is going on here? What? It's really not what I thought when I was young. So
I mean, obviously, I think Andy, you've got an interest in science fiction, haven't you?
Oh, sorry, muted.
I thought you'd been brainwashed already.
Yeah, I've always been interested in science fiction. I think a lot of science fiction films have truth in them. But I've never warmed to Disney. When I was growing up, for me, it was all about Warner Bros. Disney left me cold. I don't know about you guys.
Well, I used to watch Disney Time on TV as a kid. Like it's always on at Easter and Christmas. Never got to see the films then, because they never really showed Disney films on the TV that much in the 70s when I was little. It was only when the video market opened up, you could then get the classic Disney films on VHS, and that's where I suppose I saw most of the Disney stuff. And I never got into the Disney Club and things like that, but I was particularly interested, like Carl, was in the science fiction side of things, Doctor Who and Star Trek, Star Wars, all that kind of stuff that I grew up with. But I mean, obviously Disney have taken over the Star Wars franchise
Mm.
now, so they've kind of got that big breadwinner for them. So Carl, okay, why would they? I mean, do you think it's the whole media industry is doing something sinister, or is it just the science fiction element, or what they're using that science fiction interest to present their best kind of whatever they want to present to us in some way?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in terms of, I think it's across the media now, across every sort of arm of the media. All I mean, there are only really essentially six, but really five big companies that control the mainstream media now, certainly in America, and because their output is so global now, we are saturated with it. And then, like Andy was saying about Warner Brothers, because certainly a lot of my favourite films came out of the Warner Studios, and there did seem to be some very sort of subversive, in a good way, films, certainly in the 70s, and that came out of Warner Brothers. A lot of Stanley Kubrick's films, who I've talked a lot about, and research came out from Warner Brothers as well. So, I think potentially now Warner has shifted in the same direction that the rest have, but there was a fair few years there. I think there's delays, different periods in time when some of these media companies have shifted with what I like to call sort of global agendas and things like that, and some have come to it later than others. But certainly Disney was at least from the 1930s onwards, 1940s onwards, was very much in bed with the the elite establishment, the likes of the military industrial complex, the Department of Defense, CIA, NASA when they came along, that sort of thing. So there's a huge amount of documented evidence on that. So
Nicole, what do you think your position is of where Walt Disney was coming from? Because there was a lot of criticism from some people saying that he was actually a Nazi or had very strong Nazi sympathies, and yet the Disney Corporation was actually involved in doing a lot of anti-Nazi kind of propaganda, I suppose you could call it, because it works on both sides, not just one side. What do you think about what do you think his true motivations were so far as the Nazi issue goes?
well, I think that he certainly did appear to have some sort of sympathies with certain things. I mean, he was friends with a lot of prominent former sort of Nazi associated people, like the filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl, who did a lot of sort of propaganda films for the Hitler regime, for the Nazi regime, and Werner von Braun as well, who was obviously involved with the SS and things like that, and then brought to America with Operation Paperclip to work for NASA and that sort of thing. And he also allegedly attended these meetings. I'm just trying to find some notes on it actually, so I can read you some examples out to it, which I can't find them now. Yeah, but he certainly had. I mean, he had a lot of admiration for people like Leni Riefenstahl, and he approached her to sort of collaborate on various things, and she actually said. When they talked about it, he basically said, well, it's going to damage Disney's reputation if you're seen to be sort of involved with me, this sort of kind of thing. So there was no sort of collaboration between the two of them went on in the end. But certainly there's a huge amount of admiration. I mean, she actually said in her memoirs, Riefenstahl, sorry, this is a chap called Mark Elliott who wrote this book called Hollywood's Dark Prince. And he said about her, in her memoirs, she claims that after Kristallnacht, she approached every Hollywood studio looking for work. No studio head would even screen her movies except for Walt Disney. He told her that he admired her work, but if it became known that he was considering it, it was damage the reputation. So, yeah,
I suppose you could call it, I suppose you could kind of playing devil's advocate here. Split his kind of like his liking towards her into two categories. There's this cinematography aspect and the actual Nazi ideal aspect. And it could be argued that he was just interested in her shooting style, how she framed things, rather than the actual content itself. What do you think there?
It could be that, actually, yeah. I mean, certainly, the admiration for the artistic style, yeah. But that the chap I just mentioned, Mark Elliott, in his book, he also said that there was these American Nazi Party meetings, and there was this chap called Gunther Lessing, who was one of Disney's attorneys, and he was also a chief advisor on labour issues for Disney. And he confirmed that Wool and there was this other chap called Arthur Babbitt as well, who attended these meetings. And Mark Elliott says in his book, Walt Disney and Gunther Lessing were there, along with a lot of other prominent Nazi-affiliated Hollywood personalities. But what's interesting about that is he also said that Disney was committed to the American First movement, which was basically this idea of Hollywood's most pre-war isolationist movement, keeping America out of the war, that sort of thing. So, but then there seems to be contradictions to that. I mean, further along the line, because he was also involved with the anti-communists in the motion picture industry as well. Very well documented, that is, yeah. His
involvement with the McCarthy era type.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously Disney was seen, or you're suggesting that Disney was the one that sort of played along with the government line, but you've identified that the other media companies, the big five kind of ones that we have presently. I mean, do you want to talk about those and maybe how they've kind of got on board?
Yeah, it's very difficult for me to get into too much detail with that, because for me, it's a subject that I'm very much still researching, because I'm actually writing another book at the moment now about how all of these studios and media entities are connected. So I'm still putting together the nuts and bolts of it and the evidence. And I tend to be one of these people that likes to go with the evidence. But certainly when you look at some of these film franchises like the DC world of filmmaking, like the Superman, Man of Steel film, heavily heavy involvement there from the DoD. And I'm not sure, I think it's Sony, is it, that put out the DC films? I might be wrong on that one, but I'm not sure. I know it's definitely not Disney. And certainly the Transformers films and things like that as well that aren't Disney, although there are affiliations there with people like Jerry Bruckheimer and that. But, they're, again, films that are heavily supported by the DoD, and Star Trek as well, which is Paramount, CBS now, a huge involvement with the military and NASA and to some extent the CIA as well, documented going back right from the very beginning of the franchise, and that's still going on now, because we've had like the Department of Energy and entities like that involved with some of the recent Star Trek films, like Into Darkness and things like that, and DoD were actually involved with for the Star Trek aficionados out there, Star Trek 4, The Voyage Home as well. They actually allowed them to use an aircraft carrier which doubled up as the Enterprise ship. It wasn't the actual Enterprise aircraft carrier. They hadn't got that available at the time, but they used a different one and renamed it. And the Pentagon actually, Paramount actually allowed the Pentagon to have final say over aspects of the script of that film. So yeah, it's not just Disney. It's
So Carl, for the listeners listening to this, obviously DoD stands for Department of Defense.
Yeah.
So what do you think? A, the motivations are behind the Department of Defense, and B, what's your analysis of the type of message that they've tried to put across in films, and why have they done that?
I think superficially, it's used as a recruitment tool to get people to join up to various branches of the armed forces, whether it be the Air Force, Army, or Navy, or whatever. To a degree as well, things like NASA, because they are, Department of Defense connected. People like to think of them as not being part of the military, but there's a long history of association there. So when they're involved with scripts, for example, I mean, certainly if you look at like Ridley Scott, who was worked on G.I. Jane and wanted the Pentagon involvement in that film, but they couldn't reach agreements on what it was that Ridley Scott was portraying in the film. And ultimately, although there was some sort of superficial involvement with them initially, they ultimately decided not to get involved. And from what I've read on that, it was because they objected to certain elements of the script. Certainly the way females in the military were being portrayed in the film as well. They I'm not sure of the specifics of what they disagreed with, but there was something about the way that Demi Moore's character was portrayed in the film that reflected on how women are how they should be seen to be portrayed in the military. And I think that's what it is ultimately all about with the military, is about perception management. It's about putting this nice, squeaky clean, wholesome, a bit like what Disney does really, on the surface of any film they're involved with. And sometimes they're actually involved with films that have no military portrayal in the films. I cite one good example is the Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger Tides. It's got no, because of the historical period it's set in, it's got no sort of, as we see the modern military today involved in it. But the DoD allowed them to film from a helicopter base in Hawaii, I think it was. Yes, it was Hawaii. But that was what I've said with that. Maybe it's just a bit of a PR stunt for them, because the unit with the helicopter unit based there is called the Pirates of the Caribbean. So they thought, maybe they thought it was a good little PR stunt there for them. No military portrayal in the film, but we'll support it because it promotes that particular branch of the military. But I mean, just going back to somebody like Ridley Scott, for example, although he got turned down support from the Pentagon on G.I. Jane, if you look at a film like Black Hawk Down, which was extensively, the Pentagon had extensive involvement in the production of that film. And we were talking about what it is that their agenda might be, because the film Black Hawk Down is based on a book from 1999 from Mark Bowden of the same name. And basically it depicts the battles that were going on in Mogadishu in Somalia in 1993. And one of the things that the military really objected to in that film was this character, this chap called John Stebbins, a ranger specialist who was played by Ewan McGregor, I think, in the film. And they restructured the character. That was one of the edicts of their provisions for the script changes. They restructured the character. They even renamed him to Danny Grimes from the real person that he was based on, John Stebbins. And the reason why they'd done that, because it had turned out that, this chap Stebbins, he was awarded one of the military's highest honours, the Silver Star. It turned out that he was responsible for raping a 12-year-old boy. He was actually court-martialed and sentenced to 30 years in prison. And hence the reason why the military did not want this character being seen that way. That whole aspect of his life was completely written out of the story. And I mean, I can quote you just a little bit of something from this book called Operation Hollywood by a researcher called David L. Robb. And he was talking about the subject of Black Hawk Down. And he said that basically, quoting from him now from the book, he said, by insisting that the producers change the name of a real-life hero turned child rapist, the Army violates its own rules, which are contained in a producer's guide to the US Army cooperation with the entertainment industry, published by the Army's Office of Public Affairs. According to these guidelines, the Army will provide assistance only to films that depict real people and real events if those people and events are portrayed in an authentic manner. The Army manual states the production must be authentic in its portrayal of persons, places, actual military operations or historical events. Using Stubbins' name in Black Hawk Down would have been authentic, but it also would have been embarrassing. So it had to be changed because the Army is really less interested in authenticity than it is in positive images. So I think he pretty much sums it up there, really, what it's all, why they get involved in these things.
I think it's very kind of like the feeling I get from all of this, especially with the Army's involvement in things like Pirates of the Caribbean, where it's non-military related, it's so stage managed, which is why I kind of feel there's a lot of kind of stagnation within the Hollywood industry of late. I mean, there are some kind of like groundbreaking kind of innovative kind of films coming out, but there's also a lot of the same old dross where you just think, oh, here we go, a rehashing of 15 other films that have done the same thing. So
they're playing safe though financially. I suppose they think, oh, this has been successful before, we'll just, it's like giving out a card or something. It's
lowest common denominator, I suppose. But Carl, your whole presentation and your talk is very much kind of the even darker aspects. So shall we go into the even darker aspects beyond?
Yeah, we can do. Yeah. yeah, I mean, where would you like to begin on that? I mean, it's, I mean,
Let's go with something along the lines of either maybe occultic, satanic, dare we say it, that is a horrible subject, but paedophilic. Should we go in that kind of direction?
yeah, I mean, one of the things that's put across from certainly from Disney, for example, is that especially with Disney, is that their films are appropriate for the whole family, you know, especially young children. And we do see this. I know of people who, you know, in the school holidays and that will pop these Disney films on the box or on a DVD player or whatever. You know, pop their children down in front of them. It's a good little babysitter for children for a couple of hours, keeps them quiet. But the messages that are being conveyed in these, certainly if you look par for the course with narrative memes, you know, I mean, you've got this idea of characters on these physical and psychological journeys, but they're usually separated from their loved ones, trying to find their way home again, that sort of thing, attempting to make new lives for themselves. They go through these transformative sort of traumatic experiences, like this metamorphosis into a new being, that sort of thing. There's lots of hardship and danger and peril and that involved in it. The protagonist usually befriends some sort of non-human individual, or they've included things like ghosts and aliens and robots, even figments of the imagination along the way. And people would argue, well, that's just the way stories are told, you know. But then if you look at a Disney again, you know, you can't argue that they've got a very slanted view on wholesome family values. You know, I mean, I cite the Bambi film from 1942, you know, of a good one where the mother deer is shot by a hunter while trying to find some food for a son, and we've actually got a portrayal of blood there, you know, in this film, which is considered to be, you know, I mean, maybe, you know, if we look at things like Game of Thrones nowadays and that, you know, it's and young people, you know, kids even watch that as well for some even reason, though it's not rated for that sort of age group. But so, mate,
Bambi's a very kind of warped, dark film, really.
yeah, and things like, you know, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. You know, the Queen with his poison apple wants to bury. She actually says, you know, bury her alive, Snow White in it. You know, we've got Pinocchio, you know, being the threat of chopping him up to firewood if he gets too old, and Alice in Wonderland, the Queen wanted to decapitate Alice. You know,
it reminds me very much of kind of like the old German, very very old medieval style, or perhaps a bit later than medieval. The German fairy tales that were not in any way fluffy and light. They were really
but this is where Walt Disney got the inspiration.
He did, yeah, absolutely, yeah. I mean, you look at so many of those early stories; they're based on the Grimm's fairy tales and that sort of thing, yeah. But of all the stories that he could have chose, why those that were so graphic and so dark? You know, it's there's plenty of other stories out there that weren't like that. You know, so
maybe you know, maybe that was the kind of stuff that he was personally interested in, because otherwise he wouldn't have known the stories unless he had been either told them or read them himself. And obviously he must have enjoyed them to then want to then portray it on the big screen and invest a lot of time and money in it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, if you take, for example, we were talking about like the wholesome family values now. I mean, I cite this in my talk. If you look at the central characters, you've got these orphaned, fostered, adopted, abandoned, or they've got no family at all. They lose one or both of their parents. You've got these adopted, foster, and step parent roles in Disney. And that isn't it. My argument has always been, it's not about what constitutes a wholesome family unit, you know, nothing like that at all. As long as these characters are portrayed as loving and nurturing and caring for their charges, that's what it should be about. You know, it's not a reflection on what the family unit should be, although there is a lot of arguments out there that Disney has got something in an obsession with breaking up the traditional family unit and all that kind of thing. But leaving that aside for a moment, if you look at these characters who are supposed to be these step parent roles and things like that, you know, they're psychotic, if not homicidal. The way they treat them, they're trying to murder these stepchildren, you know, and as I say in my talk, you know, that's not really wholesome family values, you know. It's just not.
Yeah, I mean, there seems to always be, I suppose, with any film, you want to create a kind of drama, a bit of age, a bit of maybe reality. I don't know. There always seems to be in most films like a threat of some sort to the stability of the family or the character, whether it's a life or death threat or just an emotional threat of something like that, doesn't it? But you could argue, but that's what happens to people on an everyday basis, that we are always threatened with some sort of loss of livelihood or
Mm.
loss of mother or father and things like that. And they could argue back that they're just trying to reflect the world around them, but maybe they want to kind of always create a happy ending at the end. Maybe that's, a devil's advocate kind of
Mm,
response.
mm. I do understand that idea in the narrative of storytelling, but I think if we look at the media as a whole, which is very much obsessed with fear mongering as well, it tends to be an aspect of social engineering in the media. It's
I
very
guess
difficult.
it sells news, doesn't it? I mean,
Yeah, exactly.
who wants
Yeah,
to hear about a little old lady who found a fluffy cat? And I mean, they usually, well, when they have the fluffy stories in news, it's always at the end and it's about 5 minutes. Whereas
yeah.
at the beginning, it's always kind of like Donald Trump says that North Korea is going to get invaded, type of thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, certainly I read recently that I can't remember the exact figures on it. I'd have to find out the article for it. But there was this survey that was looking at how many times, and this was a few years back now. This was about 15 years ago. That how many times you could find in the American news media a story about a child abduction, and yet statistically, I think it was 10 or 15 times as many children. Well, I think it was probably about 20 actually. I'm off the top of my head. Children that had been involved, that had been killed in car accidents and things like that, but they were never reporting this. It was always about pushing the child abduction angle. And I'm quite fond of citing Stanley Kubrick on this one because I mean, if you look at the films he made, it's certainly things like Clockwork Orange and that, and they're not exactly the easiest films to watch, The Shining and things like that. But even he said in an interview in 1968, he said children's films are not an area that should just be left to the Disney studios, who I don't think make very good children's films. I'm talking about the cartoon features, which always seem to me to have shocking and brutal elements in them that really upset children. I could never understand why they were thought to be so suitable. When Bambi's mother dies, we mentioned about Bambi, he said it's got to be one of the most traumatic experiences a 5-year-old could encounter. I think there should be censorship for children for children on films of violence. I mean, if I didn't know what Psycho was and my children went to see it when they were 6 or 7, thinking they're going to see a mystery story, I would have been very angry, and I think they'd been terribly upset. I don't see how this would interfere with freedom of artistic expression. If films are overly violent or shocking, children under 12 should not be allowed to see them. I think that would be a very useful form of censorship. But Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs as well was actually 1937. I mean, when that was released in England, bearing in mind, this is like sort of 70, 80 years ago, but it was passed as an A, which was at the time was considered more suitable for adult audiences. It's got like U certificate now, hasn't it, on the DVDs and things like that. So
I
for any
suppose
age.
just one kind of like dark element that could be read into that is the whole idea of MK Ultra mind
Mm,
control and kind of like the idea of traumatizing children via these kind of like dark movies and things. But the next question is why? I mean, there is an argument that the whole the purpose of trauma that the Nazis were meddling with Joseph Mengele in the concentration camps was the idea to traumatize a child to the extent where they have alternative personalities,
yeah, yeah.
and then you could start installing kind of like programs, which is really that's probably the darkest thing you could probably
Mm,
imagine of doing that. So it kind of goes along the line of is Disney doing that? Are they presenting children with traumatic experiences in these dark movies in order to reprogram their minds? And why would be the
mm,
next question.
mm. I think you can look at it on two levels. Certainly, just in terms of your average audience watching it, who perhaps haven't gone through. And if you read, I mean, we start with the mind control literature that you read on these subjects, and even if they're not about Disney, these are about people that have allegedly gone through trauma-based mind control programming or that sort of conditioning, and regularly. These people who've allegedly gone through these experiences cite part of their programming having taken place at Disney or Disney associated places. Kathy O'Brien in her book Transformation of America has talked about it. Bryce Taylor in Thanks for the Memories has talked about it. Mary Lewis in Awakening to Realities and Mind Controls talked about it. Ron Patton in Project Monarch talked about it. Fritz Springmeier has talked about it as well. And there are these claims that these some of these the Mouseketeer type people, Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera, them sort of characters are allegedly potential victims of trauma-based mind control.
Britney Spears is a really interesting one. If people want to kind of look into this, if people go onto YouTube or Google videos and type in Britney Spears, it will be something like mood change or alternate personality or multiple personality disorder, where she's in an interview and she's talking normally. She suddenly starts getting completely emotional and starts saying, "Oh, hello,"
yeah,
and almost talking to somebody else that's not the interviewer, and it's the most bizarre thing I've ever seen.
it is. Yeah. I think that was the interview with Diane Sawyer about a decade ago. I think it was, and I think she was. It's. I think she was talking to Britney Spears about her relationship with Justin Timberlake, and she basically just sort of flips. It really is bizarre behavior. I mean, she sort of, and it's interesting that these words come up in mind control literature research. Certain words that can be allegedly like trigger words. And it is weird how Diane Sawyer uses the word spasm. And it is almost like she goes into a spasm. She becomes like sits bolt upright, looking around as if she's unsure of where she is. Like she says, "Oh, hello," and all that, and then she just becomes completely incoherent. You can't understand what she's saying. Then she starts crying, and I mean, it is really, really bizarre. Yeah, very strange.
I've also seen news anchors and news readers have kind of a freeze where, again, they're kind of either slurring their words or they can't talk properly. They're just looking at the camera. And one of the creepiest things, actually, is a bit of footage where Bill Clinton is getting ready for a TV interview. He's not actually
I've seen that, yes.
but a makeup person is kind of doing his hair and doing his face and everything, and he's just staring dead ahead in an
it's like he's in a trance, isn't it?
Yeah, hypnotic state.
Yeah.
Totally hypnotic state. And then as soon as the cameras will come on, he'll go, "Hi, I'm here, baby. Okay, let's go."
I do that even before the show, though.
but you don't sit there, Neil, just with a glazed look on your face, staring at the wall.
It depends how much your dad's drinking. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So with the dark control forces, then, I mean, as Andy said, I mean, there possibly could be agendas behind each film that we're watching. I mean, one thing that's occurred to me as we're talking about the fact that a lot of these films are bought out in the late 30s, 40s, and 50s is that the filmmakers of today were probably getting inspired by Disney back then. And so, for instance, Ridley Scott or other horror filmmakers or science fiction filmmakers would have maybe taken that artistic vision of what Disney was doing and decided, I want to do something like that. And, and subconsciously, because they saw dark things happening in Bambi and Snow White or whatever it may be, decided to go down that horror route and make Alien and The Shining, etc., etc. Would that be a valid point, do you think?
Well, it's a difficult one with Stanley Kubrick because I think he tends to be an exception to the rule. I do think he was one of those, although he was probably involved with certain things and maybe and certainly aware of certain things, he did seem to have a conscience, and he also put that into the content of his films. But with a lot of the other figures that we have in Hollywood, and you mentioned Ridley Scott is a very good example because the 1985 film Legend that he made, a very strange film, and on the DVD commentary for that, which I've actually listened to and made extensive notes on, and that Ridley Scott talked about how he got this lifelong admiration for Disney films and the influence that they'd actually had on his work. So it was straight from his mouth, And he said that when he was making Legend, he was modelling it on the Disney, that idea. And he actually said, I wanted to give Legend a more contemporary movement to it rather than getting bogged down in too classical storytelling. But it was primarily Disney animation that influenced me. And he actually got Tom Cruise, who starred in the film, to sit down and repeatedly watch the Night on Bald Mountain section from the Disney animated Mickey Mouse film Fantasia to clarify certain elements to him, to influence his character. And if you look at Night on Bald Mountain, it's loaded with occult themes. That particular section of Fantasia is. It's even got this sort of occult Angela spell that rings that drives the spirits back into, it's very sort of, and I've argued that at a time when excuse me, at a time when that film was made, when perhaps mainstream religions were more prevalent in society, that kind of imagery in a film like that would have been the antithesis of what people's belief systems at that point in time. Not really now, because people have kind of turned their back to quite a lot of degree on mainstream religion, but certainly back then it would have been an affront to that, but there it was, and people of all ages watched it and loved it, so it's subconsciously placed in there, and Disney is very good at putting subconscious stuff into their content. I mean, if you look, certainly on a thematic level, they're putting these themes, social engineered themes. It's almost like what they call the nudge units in the media, where they're nudging society and culture in certain directions. Or this is more acceptable now, so start. This is perhaps influence you to live your life more this way, kind of thing. So they certainly on a superficial level put that kind of thing in there, but then on a subliminal level, they're putting all kinds of weird crap into it. Basically, the sexual subliminal stuff as well, which is another area where you can look at stuff for hours on the internet on that one, all the sexual imagery that they've put into these animated films for children.
This is why that blank stare we mentioned earlier. You see.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
for people who are unaware of this, Carl, do you want to go into what kind of sexual imagery and how they incorporate it?
Where I can get it.
No, but it's for those who haven't seen the talk, it's quite cunning, and it's quite manipulative.
Yeah.
For instance, having the words like sex, but they would kind of integrate it within. They wouldn't just spell it out; it would be integrated within the illustration style of what you're looking at, and you wouldn't actually know it was there until you see it, and then you can't see anything else but it.
Yeah, I mean, before I do cite some examples of that, I mean, I'm quite fond of asking people the question, tell me something, I'll ask you the question now, tell me something interesting about lemmings.
Lemmings?
Yeah.
They jump off cliffs.
Yeah. Right. That is not true
Okay.
at all, right? It was a myth that was created by Disney in a 1950s nature film documentary. They actually set these lemmings up to fall off cliffs to trick people into thinking that it was a behavioural habit of lemmings. They don't do it at all.
But why?
I don't know.
What's the point?
That is very strange. I remember seeing that.
Is it an in-joke? Is it a massive
I really don't know the motive behind it at all, but it was just something that they just decided to do. But it shows how powerful the messages are, with, because you asked that question proves it. You ask most people, tell me something interesting about lemmings. They jump off cliffs, they fall off cliffs. Well, they don't do it.
It sounds like an experiment then, to see.
It is. It is just like a social learning experiment to see what the uptake on things. I know in my books I've looked at a great example is, I mean, we will go back to the sexual subliminal stuff in a second, but a great example of that is the 1938 War of the Worlds radio broadcast, where it really was not what people thought it was at all. Certainly, so even superficially on the level, it wasn't Martians invading the Earth. It was just a radio broadcast. But the reaction to it was bizarre, to say the least. And that whole radio broadcast was organised by something called the Radio Research Project, which was run by the Rockefeller Foundation. And the people that were involved in that and studying it subsequently afterwards, the reaction to it, were these people like Theodore Adorno, who was allegedly behind the social engineering steering of the music of the Beatles and things like that, and people like Frank Stanton, who went on to work for, like, I think it was CBS, and the high-profile people in the media, and they were, before they had these careers in media or music industry or whatever, they were working for organisations like the Tavistock Institute, studying the psychological process of human beings and how they react to like source amnesia, where you get your information from, and if you trust that level of information from the source, are you more likely to accept it as being real if you trust the source of that information? So I think, excuse me, yeah. I mean, the lemmings is a good example of that, but
Mm. Talking about subliminals and everything, it's really
Yeah, yeah.
interesting. Interesting you bring up the Beatles because I don't know if you've seen any of Simon Parks's talks that are quite interesting,
Yeah.
where he's actually got an original cover from the Beatles that is very, very rare because they pulled it almost immediately, and they had the Beatles sat around in white butchers' coats, looking
Yes. Yeah.
completely hypnotized
Yeah.
with bits of meat and not
Yeah.
dead dollies, but kind of like baby dolls kind of cut up with limbs all over the
Yeah.
place. What on earth has that
Yeah.
got to do with pop music in any
Was
way,
that on
shape,
Love Me
or
Do?
form? I mean, even for the 60s, that was supposed to be kind of like progressive and kind of, forward thinking, even that is a bit much for the Beatles.
Yeah.
But it's interesting what you're talking about, this research thing and this subliminals thing. What is really going on behind all this?
Mm. I mean, in the Disney output, we've got things like, I mean, these are just superficial examples. Yeah, we've got male members, male sexual organs. In the posters for The Little Mermaid, there's the minister conducting the wedding in The Little Mermaid appears to have an erection for a few frames of film. Jessica Rabbit in Who Framed Roger Rabbit doesn't appear to be wearing any undergarments for any knickers for a few frames of film. Um, there's a film where Daffy Duck sprouting an erection. Sorry, that's the same one actually. Who Framed Roger Rabbit? The piano dueling scene. Daffy Duck appears to be having got an erection at one point in that as well. Bare naked, breasted women appearing in a few frames of film in the background of The Rescuers. The word sex appearing in the sky in a scene from The Lion King. One of the promotional posters for The Lion King as well has got the silhouette of a semi-naked woman in the face of the lion. There appears to be the word sex in one of the promotional posters for Tangled as well, the Disney film. There was a VHS version, actually, a VHS video version of Aladdin, a scene where the genie flies up to the balcony and whispers to Jasmine something along the lines of "Take off all your clothes" or something like that, and Disney claimed that it was take off and go or something like that. Spoken to the tiger or something like that. But you listen to it, it's one of those strange ones. And interestingly as well, Disney actually found one and eliminated it from. I mean, most of these are still there in the content of the Disney, but Disney actually removed one from this animated short called The Clock Cleaner. Daffy Duck was heard to be saying "F you" basically, and when it was discovered, Walmart at the time pulled all the videos. Disney re-edited it and re-released the film without that in it. But the fact that it got through, and of all the other things that they haven't removed, it's strange how they removed that one. But that's a bit more blatant. That one is, I suppose, an expletive in a Disney film. But
And you've got to wonder why this is not more in the mainstream news. I mean, this is newsworthy stuff. I mean,
mm,
ITV News. It's been discovered that the word sex and Daffy Duck with an erection have been found in this movie, and they're being pulled a bit. Why isn't this? Why is this not mainstream news?
yeah,
Why is it
Maybe,
just
maybe they
kind
would put it at the very end, along with the granny that finds the plastic kittens. I did read years ago, actually, a Disney book because I'm an artist. So I obviously studied Disney as well as a
mm,
kind of because I actually was for a while trying to become a background artist,
right,
and I studied books like Disney and Warner Brothers and things like that. And I was reading a story. And it was in the days when Walt Disney was running the show. So I put this probably in the 40s or 50s. That one of the animators had put together this quick animation of Mickey Mouse basically having sex with Minnie Mouse. And they called in Walt Disney to come and have a look at it because everyone thought it was really funny. And all the chief animators were there and everything. And everyone laughed and had a great laugh at it. And then very quietly, Walt Disney had the animator who was responsible fired for it. You
mm,
see, so I'm wondering whether these other animators are trying to push their, seeing how far they can push it before they get caught, and it's maybe something of a kind of a challenge amongst Disney animators to see what they can put into films without getting
mm,
caught.
could
It may
could
be.
they also could they just be either bored, or could it be some disgruntled employees having a backlash, or could they even be thinking, right, I'm going to get fired next month, I'm just going to put this in whilst I'm still employed,
Well,
to
yeah.
screw the company.
Tim Burton, apparently in his earlier days as a filmmaker, used to work for Disney as an
mm,
animator, and he
right.
used to fall asleep at his desk. He was so bored. So you might be right.
I wouldn't be surprised at all if that's not the case. And to some degree, I've actually had that confirmed because, as I cite in my talks, I have had some contact with somebody who has worked in quite a prominent position in Disney for many years now. And the kind of stuff that she was involved with puts me in a position where I'm, at the moment, having to sort of, I can't really identify who this person is and not really talk a great deal about the kind of things she's been involved with, because that would inadvertently perhaps draw attention to who she is as well. But I did actually ask her about that. I did say to her, do you know if there are and why are they put in there? Is it just and I mean, I can read out her answer to that question if you want me to.
Yeah, go for it.
I mean, I quote it in my talk as well, but for those people who haven't seen the talk, so I asked her, are they there? And if so, why? And she said, yeah, they are. It's common knowledge in the company. Some are put in for kicks, but more are dictated from higher up. There's actually a cover within a cover. At some levels, Disney employees know that the company have been tapping the conspiracy folk. So I'm assuming that I would be categorized as one of these people, in their mind anyway. So she says that tapping the conspiracy folk as a new audience demographic. It's true that there are folks who hate watching Disney films, but they still watch and pore over the material to look for subliminals and hidden stuff. So they become part of the audience by default. It seems to sell. It sells more DVDs and theatre tickets, and as a result, the imagery is put in to cater for them. But that's only a very small part of the reason why it's done. There are high-up suits in the company who have some way-out beliefs. They want it seen and reflected in the products. There are rituals that go on all the time. People do talk about them. I've never seen one personally, but I know it goes on. There are a lot of people working at Disney who are into the into the occult, arcane mystery stuff and mythology. It's actually something that they look for when screening new employees to work as Imagineers, writers, directors, CG animators, those sorts of jobs. Ritualistic techniques and themes concentrates and directs the energy to and from the viewer, and the company is obsessed with that. That's what she actually had to say about it. So she said to me that she knows of animators who just do it just for a laugh, but she also knows that there's much more goes on as well. So
yeah. I mean, a friend of mine that I used to work with in one particular media company, he said on his night shifts they used to go to the library and fish out all copies of EastEnders, I think it was, and for a laugh, it was a sinister thing, according to him anyway. And I've known him for donkey's years, so I know he's not a sinister kind of guy. But he used to take an episode of EastEnders and basically dub swear words and all sorts of things into the scenes of the Queen Vic. And for the people that don't watch EastEnders, the Queen Vic is like the focal point pub in EastEnders, where a lot of action and discussion takes place, and there's always a lot of background noise and chat amongst the obviously the pub regulars there. And so he was dubbing in F words and all sorts of rude words into the background and putting it low down the mix, just literally because he was bored on a night shift. And he actually nearly got caught because he told one of his colleagues that what he was doing, and this colleague reported it to the boss. And unfortunately, there was a bit of lost in translation on that report, because the report was that he'd been dubbing it onto Coronation Street, not EastEnders. And so they pulled out all the Coronation Street episodes, were going through one by one, looking for evidence of it in the Rover's Return, a different pub, and never found anything.
No, never was any to find.
On it, because it's in EastEnders. So he got away with it, but I always remember chuckling about that one. So I think, a lot of it is done as a kind of boredom factor. I mean,
I'm sure it is.
As I mentioned earlier, was bored out of his brains, and he went on to do very, very dark films, as we all know, animations and things like that. So Tim Burton's got a bit of a dark vision, and makes me wonder what else is going on at Disney.
I mean, I could think of one, again, animation, but it's not Disney. But there was a French animator called René Laloux, who was responsible for science fiction aficionados, films like Fantastic Planet and the Time Masters, which was Le Maître du Temps in French. And before he got into working in film animation and that, he was a big profile character in France and to some degree in Hollywood as well. Highly respected animator. But before he worked in that industry, he used to work in lunatic asylums and what they were called then, and experimented with animation on the patients there, embedding subliminals in them to see how they would be if he could change their behaviour. So, and I mean, that wasn't his job was to working there. He wasn't actually working there to, but he was doing this as a pastime, and he's very much quoted as doing it for that reason, to see how it changed their behaviour. It wasn't just he was bored, So I think there's two sides to the coin with it. It's very, like you say, very much a lot of people out there that do it just because they can. To see if they can get away with it, to see if people will notice it, because it's a bit of a lark when you're bored and that. But then there's other people that do it for far more sinister reasons as well.
Now, we mentioned Stanley Kubrick back earlier in the recording. Now, we kind of got something to do with the moon landings, haven't we? There's a lot of talk about him and the moon landings. Maybe we can cover more of that in part 2. But wasn't it the fact that he had certain favours with NASA? NASA would lend him lenses for Barry Lyndon because allegedly he was doing a lot of favours to them with the moon landings and things like that. But, I mean, he was putting messages in his films later on, supposedly, about all this moon landing thing in various films like The Shining. Is that right?
It's a very big subject. I mean, the contention is for many people that Stanley Kubrick was involved with fakery of some of the Apollo footage. I personally am not sure. I think the evidence is strong that he knew about Apollo fakery, but I'm not sure as to whether he actually was ever involved in it. But I think he certainly knew that this kind of thing went on. And I think that there are a lot of clues to that sort of thing. Circumstantial evidence, of course, but you look at films like The Shining, and there are so many themes and pieces of imagery in the film. So the most famous one being the character of Danny Torrance, the young boy who's playing with some toy cars in a corridor, and stands up from the corridor, and he's got a t-shirt, a woolen jumper with a rocket on it, which says Apollo 11. And there's loads of sort of themes alluding to, excuse me, to Apollo 11 and that sort of thing in Kubrick's films. And I think because Kubrick has been so profound in his revelations about certainly mind control programming in a film like Clockwork Orange and the secret societies and the shenanigans that they get up to in films like Eyes Wide Shut, that people would therefore assume that Kubrick was trying to say something about the moon landings as well, because he said about other things in these other films. And I do go along with that. I do very much so. And I think Kubrick, putting aside the argument of whether he was involved with fakery, I think he was in a position to know about it because he moved in circles that were at the highest levels of NASA. He had a lot of connections with people in the military establishment, the CIA, people that worked for, again, I mentioned earlier about the Tavistock Institute, people that were heavily involved with psychology and psychiatry and all that sort of thing, So he counted them amongst his closest friends and consulted them on an awful lot of his filmmaking, especially 2001: A Space Odyssey. And that film was basically just a prelude to the NASA missions to come. It was by their own admission, Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick. It was designed in such a way as to create this wonderfully romantic vision of space. Although what we saw of the Apollo missions was nothing like that, but it was to sell the public in readiness for what was to come. A year or so later.
I believe that 2001, the book wasn't even written when the film came out. Didn't it come out afterwards, or am I mistaken?
It was written concurrently with the writing of the film. Yeah.
So it was a definite planned big effort, basically, to get the public to look at space. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Arthur C. Clarke co-wrote the screenplay of the film with Kubrick, 2001: A Space Odyssey. Clarke was. It was actually 2001 was actually the film was actually based on a short story called The Sentinel, which pretty much became the novel 2001. So the 2001 book that we come now was pretty much being written concurrently with
And of course it came out later. I mean, I heard years ago again that Arthur C. Clarke was allegedly a paedophile anyway. And this is why he moved to Sri Lanka to escape prosecution or get involved in some sort of dodgy dealings in the UK. So he moved to carry on his writing at least, and maybe other things over in Sri Lanka, which is former Ceylon anyway. But he kind of kept a low profile of. I mean, he did present things after he carried on writing, but he presented a few TV series I recall, like The Mysterious World of Arthur C. Clarke and stuff like that. But getting back to The Shining being a kind of telltale of what was possibly going on, you mentioned there the Apollo rocket on the boys' pullover, and it's been pointed out that the carpet in that film was very reminiscent of the Apollo launch pad.
The hexagonal pattern,
And that carpet shows up in Pixar films, which is like, what was it? Toy Story.
Toy Story? Yeah.
So, again, are they trying to sort of throw hints there, do you think?
Possibly. I mean, I did read an article that the director of the film was a big fan of Stanley Kubrick, and that was the reason why that carpet was put in there. But, we only have his word to take on that, so who knows? I mean, certainly Kubrick symbolism does pop up in an awful lot of areas of the media, but it's always put down to the fact that people are just such huge fans of Stanley Kubrick. I can buy that. That is the case with a lot of it. But I think it's such specific symbolism. And if you take, for example, that the hexagon shape being so intrinsic to the proverbial Saturn worship, that sort of belief system as well. Being a hexagon, being what would you call it? A two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional cube. It's and the Saturn V rockets, they were called Saturn V rockets as well, weren't they, on the launch pads? So it ties in that regard as well. So yeah,
that's right. Well, I think we're coming up to the end of part one now. So I do like the space themes, obviously, because I'm a bit of a science fiction fan like you are, Carl. So maybe we can carry on a bit of that in part two. We'll take a quick break. So we'll just say thank you very much. We're talking to Carl James. We're talking on the media and films and science fiction and how are they shaped by forces that are either darker or have other agendas. So join us for part two with Andy Chaplin and myself, and we're talking to Carl James.
See you in a bit.
This is Barry Fitzgerald from Ghost Hunters International. In my book, In the Mist of Gods, I explore the world of the fairies or fae. This is not the whimsical winged creatures romanticised in modern literature and popular culture, but old-world, intelligent, and sometimes dangerous beings hidden in the tunnels, mounds and rafts in countries all over the world. Known by many names, the fae coexist with mankind and at times come in direct contact with unsuspecting people whose lives are changed forever. In the Mist of Gods is a powerful book that chronicles my years of research into the enigma and legend of the fairy and examines their metamorphosis into the modern-day extraterrestrial phenomenon. In the Mist of Gods is available in both softcover and Kindle format on Amazon and on glenandtea.com.
Planeteye Publishing is pleased to announce the release of the award-winning novel The Girl Who Rode Dolphins by Michael Ganis. A mysterious young girl is discovered in the ocean off the coast of Haiti, surrounded by a pod of the most extraordinary dolphins ever encountered. Together they protect a secret cove on Navassa Island teeming with life, and which holds mysterious secrets that must be protected at all costs from dark forces intent on exploiting them. The winner of 5 book awards, The Girl Who Rode Dolphins is an exciting, nail-biting adventure set in the Caribbean Ocean that will leave you spellbound with its mixture of high seas action and unique mysticism. The Girl Who Rode Dolphins is available in both softcover and ebook format on planeteye.com, Barnes & Noble, and Amazon.com.
Hello, welcome back to the Paranormal Peep Show, and here we are with Andy Chaplin and myself, Neil Geddes-Ward, and we're talking to Carl James, and we've been talking about the motivations behind the film and entertainment industry and any agendas that they might have. So, Carl, we were talking briefly before the break there about Stanley Kubrick, and we were talking about the moon landings and things like that, and whether perhaps he had any dealings with it. Did you cover any further research on that, or have you kind of detracted and moved on to other areas?
It's still very much an ongoing subject for me. I kind of keep an eye on the subject all the time and try to come across new little bits and pieces. There's never a great deal that comes along. The thing with Stanley Kubrick is he was quite a reclusive person, didn't do many interviews and things like that. So what we have available really is his body of work and the few interviews that so certainly for anything from him as a person behind, what he was trying to do and what his personal motivations were is pretty much all we've got now. Little things come out from his family here and there. His widow and his daughter Vivian, one of a couple of daughters he's got, but she's spoken up a little bit. But even all the family members actually have done an awful lot of dissembling on what really was trying to sort of be conveyed in Kubrick's films. I don't know whether that's damage limitation or I really don't know, but I have always argued that Stanley Kubrick was very much somebody in the know about a lot of subjects that go on, these hidden subjects that go on in the world, cover-ups and things like that. And he tried to very much sort of address them in his films because that was his medium, that through allegory and illusion, that sort of thing, he would put it out there for people to. And I think, there's a lot of people there, including his own family, who don't really want his films being interpreted that way. They just want him to just being seen as this incredible film director, which he was. But there's much more to his work than that as well, I think. So
was he in his last film, which was Eyes Wide Shut? I believe he died during the making of that, didn't he?
He died shortly after.
Oh,
yeah,
right, shortly after. Okay.
Yeah, he. Let me just think. I think it was the film was. There's Kubrick's cut of the film, and there's a lot of people that claim that he didn't finish cutting the film because he liked to edit all of his films, but he did actually complete his cut of the film, and there are claims that film was almost an hour longer than the released film, but we've never been able to sort of confirm that. But that was released in March 1999. It was within the first several days of the month. Believed to have been around, I think it was around about the 2nd of March, because there was an interview with Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman for Jonathan Ross's film 1999 show, where they actually said that they watched the cut of it on the 2nd of March. And the Warner Brothers executives, the co-chairman, Bob Daly and Terry Semel were there and watched it as well. There was another screening where his close family and friends watched it. And then he died in his sleep, allegedly of a heart attack, on the 7th of March. So it's about 5 days after that cut was shown. So it wasn't long after the film had been completed.
And of course, there's a whole conspiracy that it was the topic of the global elite having these dark satanic style ceremonies in clothes that may or may not be the reason why he may or may not have been bumped off. And Neil, during the break, we were talking about Bohemian Grove and the kind of shenanigans that go on in California. I wonder if there's...
Do you want to tell us more about the Bohemian Grove, any guy? Carl, perhaps, because I think you alluded to it in your presentation to us at High Wycombe.
Yeah, I mean, certainly on the subject of Disney, I mean, there were several high-profile people involved with Disney that were, Walt Disney, for example, was not entirely sure whether he was actually a Bohemian Grove regular, but he was certainly a member of the Order of Demolay, which is a quasi-secret society. He's, let me think, who are they? I can't remember their names now. Certainly, Roy E. Disney was the nephew of Walt Disney and son of Roy O. Disney. He was a long-time executive at Disney, and he was a member of the Bilderberg Group, as was George J. Mitchell, who served on the board of Disney from 1995, and numerous other roles. Special envoy to Northern Ireland during the peace agreement, and to the Middle East as well in the last, after 2000, I think. He was involved. He was on the steering committee of the Bilderberg Group as well. But there was at least the names escape me off the top of my head at the moment. But there was at least two high-profile people involved with Disney who were regular frequenters of the Bilderberg Group. I do touch on them in my talk, but their names escape me at the moment. But if you look at the kind of people that were regular frequenters of Bohemian Grove, you've got people like these literary people that so it ties into this idea that people in the media, well, the media of the day it would have been back then, I've always had this connection to Bohemian Grove. Back in the early days, I mean, it was Bohemian Club was founded in 1872, I think, in San Francisco. They met at the Bohemian Grove sort of wooded area, there's things like the fact that the Manhattan Project was conceived at the Grove in the 1940s. Multiple US presidential candidates have been chosen. Certainly in 1967, there's a very well-known picture of Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan who were there. People like Tony Blair, John Major, Prince Philip, they've all visited Bohemian Grove. Early people were people like Ambrose Bierce and Mark Twain, who was a founding member of the Bohemian Club. As some people know as from his alias of Samuel Clements. Jack London, another author, well-known author who was a regular there. Clark Ashton Smith, who wrote an awful lot of 1930s pulp science fiction stories and like H.P. Lovecraft styled stories as well. Visited there in 1913. William Henry Rhodes, Sinclair Lewis, George Sterling. And then more recently, you've got people like Francis Ford Coppola, who's a very, very close friend of George Lucas's, which ties in with the whole Star Wars Disney thing and that. He gave a speech at the Bohemian Grove in 1998 called Two Republics, Rome and America. So he was a frequenter of the place. Arnold Schwarzenegger was as well. The actor Danny Glover. Charlton Heston was a real regular there. I mean, he with his connections to the neoconservatives anyway. I mean, he used to narrate highly classified military and Department of Energy instructional films, and he had one of the highest security clearances called Q level clearance for the Department of Defense and a Defense Intelligence Agency as well, top secret. I mean, he was honoured by Bush in 2003, with the Presidential Medal of Freedom and that. So he was, a lot of these, famous people that have, not just Hollywood types, but in my research, I've tied a load of material to do with Gene Roddenberry and Star Trek and that into things like Stanford Research Institute and the stuff that was going on in the early 70s with the psychic spying program and psychic warfare and all that kind of thing. And there was a lot of regulars of Stanford Research who used to visit Bohemian Grove as well. So, yeah.
Did it start off though? I mean, I've heard various things and it's a kind of dark place, blah 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 blah. But I've heard another presentation that say that we've all misunderstood Bohemian Grove, and it's just like a summer camp for the celebs or something. They have a little bit of entertainment there. But I mean, it is a strange thing that they do this kind of thing or something in front of this great big sort of huge owl statue or something, if I understand that correctly.
Yeah, I think if I'm right in remembering, I think it's like this cremation of care ceremony that they do there in the summer, and they burn effigies, and they have these sort of audio microphone system, sort of amplification system set up where you hear all sorts of weird chanting and squealing, and it's almost like a ritual sacrifice thing. I mean, the argument.
Fool!
Oh, Andy's obviously been there before, yeah.
That's one of the
thought we had
classic
an
sound
interloper from yeah.
If you kind of like, if anyone Googles Bohemian Grove, like one of the classic things is that ha ha ha,
yeah.
which reminds me of Dr. Hayes from Circus of Horrors. And then
Yes.
it starts talking about fools, and
Yeah.
it goes into all this kind of like bizarre, kind of like interwoven strange mythology to do with this kind of strange bollock owl being. But here's the thing. Okay, let's say it's just a very kind of interesting, fun kind of summer camp. It's just a bit of a laugh, etc., etc. Why are they celebrating, even if it's mock, some people say it might be real, sacrifices of people, and then going on television and telling us about morals and how we should be governing our lives in a moral way and setting laws that are supposed to be moral laws? And this also goes into the area of things like Skull and Bones, of course, which is in Yale, isn't it? And again, we've got the whole thing about the secret ceremonies, the rituals, and there's somebody that sneaked a camera in, and there was a lady that was talking about it, and somebody asked her, do you think it's just a laugh? Is it just student pranks? And she says, no, it's far worse than that. It was pretty much evil. It was like the vibe was not fun, drunken students. It was really quite a dark edge to it. So it makes you wonder what's going on with all this, really.
I mean, my argument would be with these things that, and it's the same with any kind of secretive organisation or secret society or whatever, is why the secret? Why the secrecy? Why does it need to be hidden, from the public? Secrecy implies things that need to be hidden, that need to be kept away from prying eyes, So, I mean, certainly there are some quite verifiable accounts of people who've worked in a sort of what would be the appropriate term for it? People that have worked as waiters and things like that at Bohemian Grove and that, and they've doubled up as sort of sexual playmates, and all kinds of very odd sexual behaviour. And if you just chalk that up to the fact that some of these people, these high-profile people, have got strange tastes, sexual tastes, that they wouldn't want it being known publicly. So that's the secrecy, maybe. But that still doesn't explain all the weird ritual enactments that they have there. Whether they're real or not, they are still being enacted in some form or another. And you have to ask why. I'm not I'm a spiritual person, but I have no affiliation with any sort of religious belief system of any sort, really, to be honest. But even I can recognise when something's a bit odd, that there's not perhaps the right kind of intention behind these beliefs. And you have to look at these things. I know, again, most mainstream religions do have their origins in ritual sacrifices and that, it's just been watered down over the years, but again, the fact that they're still practicing these things, or even if they're just enacting them, even if there is no real sacrifice that goes on there, but it's just an enactment of it, it's still very odd.
Maybe it's a sort of psychological thing in itself, in the way that it kind of brings people into the fold, as it were, and says, this is our secret, you keep this secret, and so therefore it's a ritual that kind of binds and unites them in some way. And so therefore they feel compelled now to keep everything secret there. And maybe that's where they discuss things, the fact there's presidents and other people there, powerful people, the elite, etc., the media, the film people, etc. And a bit like the Bilderberg Group, it's where they discuss policies. On a kind of their big film set, if you like, it is a strange thing because normal folk. Who's normal these days? God, we don't go around there. There's the pagan Wiccan rituals, and I'm not a pagan, but I've been privy with my artwork and that to see a lot of people do these rituals, and I've never really felt not comfortable in the fact that I found any of them disturbing or anything like that. I just didn't feel any kind of affiliation to it. I didn't feel like I was moved in any emotional way, shape or form to kind of do them. But it just didn't do anything for me, really. So I kind of wonder why these people do that kind of thing. But I guess each to their own. I'm at a loss to explain why they want to do it, really.
There is an argument that all of these belief systems go intricately tied back to psychological warfare, going back thousands of years, the ritual is about, to some degree, fear. It's also about empowerment as well. That when you have elite people in privileged positions in society that think themselves apart from the masses, from everybody else, that they owe something, a debt to their position. And there's a lot of literature out there that suggests that these rituals are done for their empowerment, for energy transfer rituals, that sort of thing. Whether you believe in that sort of thing, I do think there's something to it. That it's in some way empowering them and blessing them for their privilege, and the fear aspect comes into it as well, because anybody who is a prying eye, or anybody that goes there and just works on a low level, they're naturally going to be intimidated by these things. It kind of harks back to what we see in Stanley Kubrick's film Eyes Wide Shut, because the threat of what the Tom Cruise's character has seen in that film. Does he really want to talk about what he's seen? And from my record, it's been a little while since I've seen the film now, but my recollection is that he doesn't really talk to anybody as such about what he's seen. The only real conversation, and even that's a bit vague, is with the Ziegler character at the end of the film. Not Polanski, I can't think of his name now, the actor who plays him. But they talk about, and even he's saying, maybe you just misinterpreted it. Maybe you didn't really see what you thought you saw. It's just one of these things that we all gather together and do, and all this kind of thing. That you can't argue with the fact that many, and not all, but many of these people that proverbially rule the world, control the world, sort of thing, that they do have some strange ways of looking at the world, and they do look down their nose to some degree at the rest of it, and in some cases quite a large degree at the masses. They consider us cattle to some degree and things like that, these derogatory terms. So yeah.
Was the Eyes Wide Shut film maybe Kubrick trying to attempt to tell the truth about what he's seen going on in Hollywood with hidden societies, secret societies, and big large owls and that kind of thing? Because there's an element of I've not seen the film, so I don't fully understand it, but I've heard references to it about how they let their child get walked away at the end of the film by two sinister-looking men, and there's kind of inference that something bad's going to happen to her or something like that. I mean, was Kubrick trying to sort of spill the beans again on not like just the NASA moon hoax thing, but maybe what's going on with the elite masses? I mean, we keep hearing about it in the UK of paedophiles in Westminster and things like that. Is it something like that he was trying to tell?
I think so, because I mean, again, it is only my opinion, but I think the body of circumstantial evidence with the themes and allusions in his film is very much there. His early films, films like Lolita, it is about underage sex, between an older man and an underage girl, and the principal difference between the film and Nabokov's book, the story that the film is based on, is the extension of Peter Sellers' character in the film, and alluding to this idea of there being networks of paedophiles out there, establishment paedophiles, that sort of thing as well, and that is kind of alluded to in. Not overtly, but it is kind of alluded to with several themes throughout Eyes Wide Shut. And there is this scene at the end where it does appear as though Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman's daughter is being led away by these two chaps, and they kind of don't really react to it and just kind of carry on having their conversation, which concludes the film. But what's interesting is it certainly appears that some very eagle-eyed viewers have compared these two chaps to a scene earlier in the film, where this party that Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman go to, where the Ziegler character has been having this sexual tryst with this prostitute woman, and also been taking drugs upstairs. She basically goes into like an overdose state, and he calls Tom Cruise, who's a doctor in the film, to come up and basically bring this girl around, and because he doesn't want to be responsible for the murder of this girl, so he's like covering his own back basically. And the illusion is, we'll keep this between ourselves. But at that party, the two of the guests there are these two chaps that you see leading their daughter away at the end. But the principal central piece to the film is that Tom Cruise becomes aware of this gathering through his friend Nick, who's sort of like a keyboard player, who's playing keyboards at this gathering with a blindfold on, so he can't see what's sort of going on there. But he gets the password to get in there, but it's not the full password, so they catch him out eventually. But he goes in and he sees sexual orgies going on, and these bizarre rituals and chanting, and everyone's wearing these sort of occult laced masks, and there's this central red cloaked character who's like the overseer of the ceremony, master of ceremonies, and he alludes that when they're basically going to give him his punishment for getting in there when he shouldn't have. This one masked woman vouches for Tom Cruise. Basically, it's alluded that that she may be one of the other characters that we see in the film, but we don't see her under the mask at the gathering, so we don't know for certain of this. But she says she'll vouch for him to protect him so he doesn't lose his life. But the inference there is that she will suffer in place of him. Somebody has to be sacrificed. This ritual sort of thing. So I think so, yeah. And I think, there are allusions to mind control in Eyes Wide Shut as well, but there are allusions to mind control in many of Kubrick's films as well. So it's a lot of themes there that he's putting across. And I think that is very much what he was trying to do with his work, yeah.
So
go ahead, Andy, go on.
Earlier in the interview, you mentioned something about rituals done in terms of kind of like movies, and I don't know if you meant kind of like rituals that were done to try and make them more successful or kind of on their launch. But I'll just tell you briefly, there's a lady that I know in London who is going to remain nameless, but she lives next door to somebody who I think is fairly high up in the security management of certain record companies. And he says, allegedly, apparently, that for each major album that gets launched, each kind of, big album, there are record companies that, believe it or not, have special ceremonies, occult type ceremonies, not quite eyes wide shut, not quite to that extent, but certainly some kind of occultic, whether you want to call it pagan or whatever, ceremonies to try and almost energetically charge the albums to kind of either be more kind of profitable or popular or whatever. Have you heard of this, Carl?
I have, yes. I've been a jobbing musician for over 20 years, and although I'm not ever been involved in this, very much sort of gigging on, very much on the edges of the music scene, but you do meet people from time to time who talk about these things. And I've heard that mentioned on several occasions. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, I have heard that. Yeah. So, and it's interesting as well that just dipping back into the Disney theme for a minute is that the success of Star Wars. Take of it what you will, but I've mentioned this before in talks and interviews. But this chap called Preston Nichols, who was allegedly involved with like the Montauk Project and associations with the Philadelphia experiment and things like that. But in his book Music of Time, he claimed that he was close friends with Mark Hamill, who played Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, and that when Star Wars was being made, Lucas was in need of a sound man because he'd allegedly sacked several of them. But Mark Hamill had said that he knew Preston Nichols, and that he was, for a period of time, was employed to work on the sound for Star Wars. And Preston Nichols claims, from actually quoting him here, he said, "When they actually filmed Star Wars, I literally saw two psychics or adepts that were concentrating on the film as it were running. They were putting some sort of psychic overlay on the film. I recognised what they were doing because it was similar to what I had done with musical recordings. I assume that Lucas learned this technique on his own. I believe this is why the Star Wars movies achieved unprecedented popularity."
That is bizarre.
That's amazing, isn't it? Wow.
That's bizarre.
Definitely the Force there with him then.
Yeah.
Well, I think, and you guys will probably agree that people like Gene Roddenberry and George Lucas probably know far more than they're letting on. Where they're getting their influences from, who knows?
Well, wasn't there I think maybe it was Carl that told me, or Ben Emlyn Jones, perhaps, that Gene Roddenberry, and for those that don't know who Gene Roddenberry is, he was the creator and writer of Star Trek, the original series. I think he was describing it back then in the early 60s, as Wagon Train to the Stars. That's how he pitched it to the studio executives at the time. But he got a lot of his storylines or influences for the show from this kind of channeled kind of material or something in a psychic circle. Have you heard that, Carl?
Yes, Gene Roddenberry was a very, very well-connected chap. He, well, certainly if you look at Star Trek in the 1960s, there was heavy involvement from the military. I mean, there wasn't a week went by where people like Roddenberry and the actors involved in Star Trek, like William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy, and that were being taken to these military bases for given awards and things like that. I mean, they went to NASA an awful lot as well. And the RAND Corporation was heavily involved with the early days of Star Trek as well, and numerous other sort of think tanks and government-sponsored think tanks and things like that. But what's fascinating about Gene Roddenberry is that during the mid-1970s, he was close friends with this chap called Sir John Whitmore, who was basically, most well known for being a racing driver in the 1960s, quite an illustrious career as a racing driver in England. And John Whitmore was involved with this group called Lab 9 that was based in Ossining in America, in New Jersey. And the chap who ran this group was this, a lot of people might know his name, this chap called Dr. Andrej Paharic. And he founded this group called Lab 9. And basically what Lab 9 was all about was this idea of using, they had an interest in psychic phenomenon, ESP, telepathy, telekinesis, remote viewing, all this kind of thing. But the principal idea behind Lab 9 was that they were allegedly, if you believe in such things, were in psychic contact through sort of channeling and that sort of thing with these extraterrestrial, extra-dimensional beings or entities, whatever you want to call them, called the Nine, or the Nine Principles and Forces. And Gene Roddenberry actually went to Lab 9, sat in on these channeling sessions, had messages conveyed to him from these nine entities and all that. And they took him to, John Whitmore arranged for Roddenberry to go and see various experiments that were going on at various research institutes around America. He stayed at Whitmore's home in England, stayed at Lab 9. And they also asked Gene Roddenberry to write a potential movie script based on what he had seen at Lab 9, talking about this group and the kind of people that were involved with it. It would take too long to list all the people that were involved in Lab 9 and its predecessor group that was called the Round Table, different from the Round Table that we know of in this country, but there are some affiliations. But these people were really, really powerful, from elite families, like I'm trying to think of some of them off the top of my head. No, I can't think of them off the top of my head, but it's a lot of elite families were, members of elite families were involved in this.
Rockefellers and Rothschilds.
Loosely, some of these people were, yeah. But I can't remember them off the top of my head. It's been a while since I've done a talk on this one, but but basically he went there, and what came out of that was that they asked him to write this script, and for some reason they didn't like it that much. Gene Roddenberry actually wrote it, and they didn't like it because they wanted more about the actual message that was allegedly coming from the Nine, as opposed to this script that he'd written, which was more about the things he'd seen and the places he'd been and the kind of characters that he'd been involved with and all that kind of thing. But he did say afterwards that he'd had a profound effect on him. He wasn't sure whether what he'd actually seen was legitimate or not, but it certainly had a profound effect on him. And we know it had a profound effect on him because if you read all the literature on the making of the first Star Trek film, Star Trek the Motion Picture, it very much chimes with all these things that he was exposed to when he was going to Lab 9. One of the things that Dr. Andrej Paharic talked about was this idea that there was this vast machine-like intelligence that was on its way to Earth, and some of the people believed that the Nine were actually this entity. But Paharic very much believed that this entity, this machine entity travelling to Earth, was responsible for a lot of the channeling phenomenon that was going on and the messages that people were getting from space and all that. And Gene Roddenberry goes and writes this film. I know a lot of other people had input on the script of it as well, but the story of Star Trek the Motion Picture is essentially about this massive machine intelligence that's coming to Earth, that's finding its own consciousness and wants to merge with humanity. And all this. It was the same principles that he'd learned from Andrei Puharich, you know.
Sounds worryingly familiar to a lot of things that a lot of people are talking about. I keep referring to Simon Parkes because I'm quite a fan of Simon Parkes. This is exactly what he's saying, that there is a dark artificial intelligence force that, and he also says that this is the whole thinking behind the whole humanism agenda, and even, dare we say it, the transgender agenda. This kind of thing that's suddenly popped out of nowhere. I mean, you know, if men want to dress as women, I don't care. You know, who cares? But it seems to be this thing about, suddenly it's popped out of nowhere, and suddenly it's kind of like being implemented within children's education. This is where it gets really dark for me personally. There was a BBC program about kind of like gender stereotypes and how boys and girls within a classroom kind of see themselves, and almost I saw it as kind of trying to slightly warp their minds, as in getting rid of the whole concept of male and female, to serve this weird kind of transgender agenda. Now, I will say again, if like a man wants to be a girl or a girl wants to be a man, I don't care. If men want to dress as women, I don't care. What I do care about is when this is pushed onto, for instance, young impressionable people in schools. That's when it gets a bit dark, and I see there's a weird kind of almost artificial intelligence transhumanist agenda backed up with this. What do you think on that?
I do, very much so. Yeah, I mean, there's been a number of science fiction writers have written about this. Certainly, Philip K. Dick was very well known for
inappropriate name there, but carry on.
Well, yeah. I mean, in his life, he believed that he'd had several encounters with this intelligence, as what it was. But it's interesting that he alludes to transhumanism in a number of his works, like things like Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and things like, which was the basis for Blade Runner, Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, which is all about artificial, replicants and that kind of thing. So it very much chimes with that sort of thing. But I've read the literature on, and again, like you, it is entirely up to people what they want to do. I've got no issue with that whatsoever. But again, exactly the same. You do see this kind of transhumanist, and it links in a lot with Saturn worship as well. There's many themes that cross over between Saturn worship and the transhumanist agenda. And I find it interesting that, given that, and I've put quite a bit of material out there on the transhumanist, transhumanism and Saturn worship in Doctor Who, for example. And what do we have now with Doctor Who? We have the Doctor, for the first time ever, transmuting into a woman. I mean, what is that saying to all those little, those young kids out there that love Doctor Who? I mean, I have an article from August 2017, very recently, of it's entitled "BBC and Attempt to Gender Neutralise Class of 7-Year-Olds." It's staggering that this kind of, the BBC very much the transhumanist agenda and things like that. Yeah.
And talking about it. I was going to say that I saw something recently on Facebook. It must have been last night I saw it, where a class, I can't remember what the country was, and you might have seen this yourself, Andy and Carl, is where they're trying to get kids to accept aliens. And they've got some kid made up to look like a kind of half alien, half human type thing.
Yeah.
And, they talk about the greys in UFOlogy, about being, neutral genders and things like that. They're neither male or female, supposedly. Yeah. I'm wondering if that's what we're being all led up the path for.
Again, I want to bring Simon Parkes into this, because he makes us aware of, there have been drills in schools, apparently, and I kid you not, this is public taxpayer money paying for this, drills where they've kind of like it recruited the local police, and they've created a mock alien spaceship in different playgrounds in different schools around the UK, as if aliens have landed. And I kid you not.
Wow.
And I see, and he's shown photographs of this. And the children are told, "Oh, come outside. There's a spaceship that's crashed." That's wonderful story time and etc. But they've brought in the local police and they've cordoned it off, and they've got people dressed in biohazard suits, and they've mocked up this UFO spaceship. And what, this is public taxpayer money. What happened to learning about maths and English and things that are actually part of their education? Not only that, but there's another story from Simon Parkes where somebody he knew, and I've seen the photographs of this, there was like a carpet that was in a kid's nursery school, and the carpet had sort of a mat type thing. It had an image of the globe with lots of people from different races holding hands around it, and intermixed with that was an alien grey. And there's no way that could be a human, because it was grey and it had a big head and it had big black eyes and it was short. There's no way that could be like another race. So for instance, it's not Chinese, it's not African, it's not South American. It was a grey. Simon then wanted to go and get this mat type thing. He phoned up the school. He asked, "Can I have it?" And they said no. And apparently, what actually managed to happen, he saw it in a skip. And he opened like a corner of it to show this grey, and took a quick photo of it. And I've seen the photo. And if you trawl the internet, and if you listen to Simon Parkes' speeches, you'll see this image, and it is a grey. Interestingly, he went further. He then went on to find out the manufacturers of the carpet, and he says, "Can I get hold of one of these carpets?" And he said, "Yeah, sure, no problem. We'll show you a sample." The sample they showed him was where the grey alien was not there. It had been replaced by a human. They pulled it essentially, and he said, "Oh, what about the one with the grey alien? Oh, we don't do that anymore. We don't do that anymore." So it was pulled.
It's interesting because there's lots of adverts like car insurance or house insurance where they got grey sitting on a sofa getting their insurance sorted out. You're thinking, why are we? And then you got the Space Invader crisps or something,
Well, they've been around for quite a few years actually. They haven't they? But
But you're right. There is like this upping of alien and alien related things in marketing campaigns, in films, movies, television programs, and now kids' education.
Yeah.
It's bizarre, isn't it? And where's it going? I mean,
this is it. Who can guess? I mean, it's not a world I'd want to see, to be honest.
do you think this is like a acclimatization for full disclosure? Do you think this is where this is going?
I'm not sure. Because I think there's a lot of disinformation out there with the whole sort of ET UFO topic. I do think there are some genuine cases, but I think there's a lot of misdirection, a lot of disinformation there as well. So I'd have to reserve judgment on that one.
Could the ETs be making films about themselves through the Hollywood media industry? You know. But interesting, you mentioned the Star Trek the Motion Picture made back in 1979 with the Voyager probe. The story was it was a Voyager probe that was launched around that time in the late 70s to go out to the outer planets, Voyager 1 and Voyager 2. But in the Star Trek film, they'd got Voyager 6 or Voyager 6, but it had gone so far out into space it had kind of lost contact with humanity, spent sort of 300 years out on the outer edge of the galaxy or something, and come into contact with this kind of machine planet or something, and they kind of recruited it and went back to the head planet. But a bit of dirt got on the nameplate, so they couldn't have the intelligence to rub and clean it down. So it actually said Voyager, so they called it Voyager. And it was actually based, I think, the original the original script for that was taken from an earlier TV Star Trek episode, I think called Robots Return. So they were rehashing the idea, weren't they?
Yeah. I mean, that Robots Return was actually I can't remember what the series was called. It was like an aborted science fiction series that Gene Roddenberry was working on.
He'd done something on in the 70s as well, I believe. Another series, Earth or something.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember what it was called. I think it was Earth 2 or something. I know there was a series in the 1990s called Earth 2 as well, but that was a different thing. or Genesis Earth, I think.
That
Something like that. Yeah. It escaped my memory, but I know that he'd written this script called The God Thing, which was based on that Robot's Return story. It was essentially the same story. He regurgitated the same story for all the better part of 8-9 years. You know, this whole idea of this robot entity that was, you know, this machine intelligence, you know, AI intelligence thing. It's hardly original in science fiction because there's plenty of other writers who've written about it, but it's what we were saying before. You have to wonder if this story has been long period of gestation because it's been acclimatizing people to a certain way of thinking. You know, what it would be for, I really don't know.
I mean, if you think about it, in the 50s, we were in lots of science fiction films with flying saucers, because that was when the spate of flying saucers was supposedly coming around Washington and various sightings and things like that. And then later on, we're kind of getting more of the creatures like the killer aliens, the big monsters like Ridley Scott's Alien and the Thing and stuff as well. As if we're being shown that aliens are the enemy. So it's almost as if we're being geared up to view the ET things as enemies. Because it was something to do with Werner von Braun saying that the last false flag event they'll do after terrorists and stuff like that will be an alien invasion. Have you heard of that one?
Yeah, memory serves me correctly. I think it was from the Disclosure Project. It was Carol Rosin, was it, who was worked
that's it.
for
the other day.
for Werner von Braun.
That's it. That's precisely it.
Yeah, and she said that he basically said, I think he'd said on numerous occasions, but he'd said it shortly before his death as well.
And Werner von Braun used the term rogue state, and what is the media calling North Korea at the moment?
Well, yeah. Interestingly, I don't watch a huge amount of television now. To be honest with you, I only really ever watch it for research purposes. And somebody pointed me to a television series called American Gods. I don't know if you've heard of it. Somebody said the symbolism in it is really, really bizarre. You want to check it out and have a look at it and all that. And basically the story is, I think it's Ian McShane who plays the main character in it. It used to be, was it Lovejoy years ago before he popped off to America? And
that's it. Lovejoy,
yeah.
I've seen one. I saw one episode on Amazon Prime, I think.
Right,
Carry on.
Well, basically the story is about this war that's coming between these old gods and these new gods. And the new gods in it are the internet and the media and all this kind of thing. You know, we'll get worship from the masses now because they don't believe in the old gods anymore, but they worship technology, they worship all this, you know, transhumanist thing and all that kind of thing. And as part of their agenda, they create this almost like a fake view of reality around this wall inside this police station office thing or something like that. And they're showing all these like cartoon style images of war with North Korea, the rogue state and all this kind of thing. And the episode's literally just, you know, I think it went out just before the recent stuff with Trump and all that, you know, where they've been banging the war drum again and all the rest of it. It's all theatre as far as I'm concerned, you know, it's just misdirection, but tub thumping, as I call it.
I mean, there was references also, like episodes of The Simpsons that supposedly predicted certain things, and there was supposedly predictions of 9/11 in Back to the Future films and things like that.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like someone's got they know what's going to happen and they're being tipped off about it to put it in their films and things.
Yeah, there is this idea of tacit consent, isn't there? Tacit approval that by programming the notion, if not the exact specific details. They can put some of the details into it by people who know beforehand when these things are possibly going to happen, and by programming it into the media, which gets soaked into our subconscious. You know, our subconscious just has no real. It has a filtering. The consciousness is the filtering mechanism, but by and large, we store every piece of information we're exposed to. You know, and then we decide whether it's useful and needs to be kept or not. But that initial exposure is there, so we're certainly acclimatized to all kinds of concepts, so that when something like 9/11 goes down, for example, when that scenario plays out, we are, although we're shocked by it, there's also a niggling feeling of, well, we're hardly surprised, because the destruction of the Twin Towers, we've kind of seen that thing happen before, in films like Independence Day, and even films, there's plenty of examples of that. So 9/11 is just one example, but there's many, many others. And going back to what we were saying before about with Andy about the whole ET subject as well, it's what is going on there. I mean, is it acclimatization? Is it preparedness for when these certain scenarios play out? It doesn't necessarily follow that it's disclosure, but it could be that some kind of false flag thing goes on further down the line, and then we're not so surprised for it when it comes along. It's like technology as well. When technology changes, if you showed the kind of technology that we take for granted to somebody, if you was to able to travel back in time and show that even 20, 30 years ago, people would think of you along the lines of being a something akin to a wizard or something. You know what I mean? For the things that this piece of technology could do. Certainly, if you went back further, they really would think you were a god or something. So technology has become the new via the media. The media is the central mouthpiece of all these agendas. It's what acclimatizes us and steers us in certain directions, perception management, all the rest of it. Yeah.
If you think about it, in the last sort of 100 years, we've got used to the whole thing of being told things on a daily basis by radio, wireless in the early days, and radio and TV and movies, as it's all kind of the technology for that has all developed in the last sort of 70 years or so. And there's not a day goes by, at least certainly in the Western world, and the vast majority of the world switches on some device these days to get information.
Yeah.
And that information was not around 150 years ago.
No.
And so the way our whole kind of psyche is now being manipulated or battered in some way, it must have an effect upon us. It's got
I do believe it does, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, the old town crier days, they're far gone, and it was a very simplistic way of presenting the news. Something's happened on a local level, and ring a bell, ding, ding, and that's it. And people kind of knew because they saw it happening, But these days, we don't know, and there's the whole thing about the false news. Are we really being presented with false news, or is that a cover story to deflect from the fact that the media are being caught out and have been presenting false news over the years?
Well, I think there are many examples of the news actually of faking things outright, and I'm in the process of researching some of that now for my new book.
For instance, Carl, the first Gulf War, you probably
absolutely with the statue and that, yeah. And the Scud missile that was. I was under the impression until fairly recently that was filmed in an American studio, but I think it was. I found out subsequently it was actually in Qatar. I think it was. So it's close by, but they were still faking it. It was still like a blue screen, green screen.
Yeah.
Nevertheless,
had the whole gas. Gas.
Yeah, gas masks on and everything.
And then after it, they'd have a good laugh and a bit of a giggle, and it just proves that some of the news, not all the news, but some of the news is utter rubbish.
Yeah. A relative of mine, very literally within the last couple of days, I'm sure he won't mind me mentioning this, but actually my nephew, he said to me that he saw something on a news, I think it was Euro News or something like that the other day, of this, he was vague on the details of where it actually was, but some sort of military type thing was going on somewhere. And the footage that he nearly fell through the floor, because the footage that was showing, he recognised from a computer game that he played in the past, Call of Duty.
Now we've seen that before.
It wasn't real.
They'd used Planet showed us something like that before.
It's happened on several occasions. Yeah, Richard's shown stuff like that. Yeah.
Very realistic looking tanks or something like that. Yeah. So where are we going with this? I mean, we've got another sort of 10 minutes now before we wrap up here. So, I mean, is it a manipulation of our human consciousness, or is it an unintentional manipulation? Is there... I mean, they've learned, obviously, the fact that, if you can trigger a dog to salivate with the sound of a ringing bell, as in Pavlov's dogs, and we're up, quite above dogs in the chain of evolution, supposedly, is there a ringing bell that's going off and we're salivating all the time to the media? And are we being controlled? And like a dog is told to go and lie down or something, we're being told in many ways to lie down whilst other things are happening above our heads that we're not privy to.
Mm. I've had some contact with people who've worked in the media and things like that, and it does seem to be coming back to me that the kind of R&D that goes on now, certainly in the big companies in America and that, and that to some degree with my Disney contact as well, that there is this obsession, where I mentioned it in my talk, about energy and consciousness, and how technology can be used through the media to influence human behavior, and almost to the point of completely reshaping our perceptions of reality around us, not just via the information that it changes our perception of view via information, but on an energetic level that is going on as well. Of course, because I'm not in that field, so I wouldn't know. I haven't seen it myself, so I've only got these people's accounts to go on. But I did find it interesting that when I was researching the origins of television and that, I found this wonderful quote from Nikola Tesla, who basically invented the first, television way back before the official history of television is documented. And in his quote, he said that one of the things that he thought television could ultimately be used for was to read human thoughts and to shape human thoughts as well, reshape human thoughts. That was over 100 years ago, way back. And I also found some stuff on how some of the very earliest, what you could loosely call televisions, these like copper panels type things and that, where energy was sort of transmitted across it and that, were used in sort of channeling of entities, energetic entities and consciousness from other realms and all that kind of thing as well. Principally, it was this idea of like the old sort of what would you call them? Like the old sort of table tapping type thing and all that, it's like that sort of thing. Yeah, is there anybody there kind of thing? Entities from the other side, or whatever, spirits from the other world and the other realms and that. And it was very much the idea of the origins of television was it could be used in that way. It was all about energy and consciousness. So it follows, if you look at the way the media works, it follows that has always been the case. If you look at the role of the Tavistock Institute, for example, in the early days of the mainstream media as it became, and their obsession with understanding human psychology and energy and consciousness, again, it all ties up. And my Disney contact has said that as well. Like I say, she said that Disney are obsessed with it. I mean, when I do my talks, I point out things like the fact that electrostatics, magnetism, capacitance, electrical currents, they play a role in defining our environment, and light and sound can reprogram human DNA and all kinds of DNA as well. And there's plenty of demonstrable technologies out there that shows that audio and visual and can generate both negative and positive energy fields in human beings and that. So, understanding that energy ultimately gives you the ability to manipulate consciousness and reality, whether that be in a positive way or a negative way, but it's the intent. It comes down to intent. And if we believe that everybody in the media has got nothing but the best interests of the masses at heart, then that's fine. If people want to believe that, then but I don't believe that they do. So therefore the intent isn't squeaky clean and whiter than white behind this effect upon human energy and consciousness.
It's also interesting the whole thing about with the media, mainstream media, that is that any time you kind of try and present something like paranormal discussions or paranormal research, really strong research that has a good basis to it, they always lop it off at the head and try and get rid of it or downgrade it in some way, and they'll always have these skeptics on there who are paid skeptics. I mean, like the UFO thing is one case point. Carl Sagan was paid, allegedly, so I've read and heard, by the CIA to basically downgrade UFOs. There's nothing to it, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that's the end of the story. And yet he secretly had an interest in the phenomena and possibly believed it, so I'm led to believe anyway. So the fact that we're seeking brave new worlds and space and dimensions and things like that is that almost that the powerful elite, Bohemian Groves or whatever, don't want us to know about it, and we're shut in this box and we're being drip fed this goggle box vision of the world.
Yeah.
And we're, don't get involved in the occult. It's dangerous messages type of thing, because otherwise we might peer out the box and start to find out our true nature. And we're not just pieces of meat walking around on this biological planet type of thing.
Yeah. I've argued very much that it's very dangerous to. I'm not a proponent of certainly satanic rituals and things like that in any way, shape, or form. But I think there are a lot of these practices out there, a lot of these beliefs, and that I don't share them. But I think it's dangerous to just outrightly demonize them and just reject them out of hand, because it's not so much these things that go on; it's the intent behind them. It's the intent behind them that's the problem. And I argue that understanding our true nature, our true nature as energetic conscious beings, is one of the principal things that the ruling elite do not want us to get. They do not want us to understand that, because it harks back to a time maybe in humanity where we were capable of doing so much more, that we really were truly in touch with our environment and our surroundings and our place and energy, all the rest of it. And they use the media as it's a principal tool, the media, to direct us away from understanding that realisation.
Yeah, they're the big sweeties, basically. That's being offered by the naughty man down the street type of thing, aren't they? Yeah. Well, Carl, thank you very, very much for taking part in our show tonight. It's been very, very fascinating. I'm sure we just skimmed the surface of what is a vast, vast amount of interesting knowledge out there, isn't it, Anne?
It is, very much so. Carl, have you got any books, websites, contact emails, Facebooks, anything like that you want to say to people how they can contact you or see your work?
Yeah, my principal source of research, and that is my website, the blog, the truthseekersguide.blogspot.com or .co.uk will work as well. I've got links on there to my Facebook page. I'm on Facebook. I've got a YouTube channel as well with videos of my talks and some presentations and videos and things like that I've done. I've got 3 books out at the moment. Science Fiction and the Hidden Global Agenda, Volumes 1 and 2, which I published last year. They're actually updated from an earlier version I did in 2013. And I've also got a book out now called What Really Happened at the London 2012 Olympics, if anyone wants to check that out. So, yeah.
Cool.
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show.
Yeah, but that sounds brilliant. We'd perhaps like to have you back to talk about
absolutely,
the
yeah,
Olympics,
it's been great.
And further information on this. You got the new book coming out, you say. So when's that?
It's out. It's actually out already. Yeah. Right, it's been out for about a month or so, I think.
Okay.
6 weeks.
People can get that from your website or off Amazon. Or?
It's been published by Lulu Publishing, but so that the people can order it from there. I think it's £11. That one is. They're all roughly around about the same price with postal packaging. I think Volume 2 of Science Fiction and Hidden Global Agendas is about £1 or 2 more. I think because it's a bigger book, more pages. But if the links to those books on Lulu are on my blog as well, so people can. They're all over the place, so people can just click on them and go straight to Lulu and order it from there. So
brilliant. Excellent stuff. Well, thank you so very much indeed for taking part. It's been fascinating, as I say.
Really appreciate it. Yeah.
No problem.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Carl.
Right, we'll say good night from us at the Paranormal Peep Show. So it's good night from myself and good night from Andy.
Yep, we'll see you next time. Thanks, folks.
And good night from Carl as well.